Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony. Accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God, in pity, made man beautiful and alluring after his own image. But my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him. But I'm solitary and abhorred. In today's video we're going to talk about the author of these hunting lines, the mother of science fiction, and a woman whose life was filled with so much loss and pain that this words seem to echo straight from her soul. This is the story of Mary Shelley. Most of the information that I'm going to share with you in today's video comes from this book by Miranda Seymour. Honestly, I was actually planning to read Mary's own journals first, but, well, the press was a bit of a horror story on its own. If you got as obsessed with Frankenstein as I did and want to understand the psychology behind it deeper, I can really recommend this biography, because Mary's life and her experiences are inseparable from the emotional and psychological world of both Victor and his creature. But if you'd rather skip 600 pages, don't worry, you'll get plenty of insight from this video too. And we will start from the very beginning with the people who shaped her mind long before she created Frankenstein, her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. I firmly believe that there does not exist her equal in the world. I know from experience, we were formed to make each other happy. They were both rebels in their own fields. Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, stood right at the dawn of feminist movement. In 1792, she published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a revolutionary book that argued women aren't naturally inferior to men, they only appear so because they are denied education and opportunity. She believed women should be free to think, to choose, to live, ideas that were shockingly radical for her time. William Godwin was the first modern anarchist, and in his An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, he set forth the idea that reason and education could lead humanity to moral perfection without the need for a state. They believed that a person should be free from all artificial restrictions such as state, church, marriage, and property. Both preached and practiced the idea of free love. It's also important to mention that Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had a deeply emotional and melancholic nature, one that led her to several suicide attempts. Her first major attempt came after a painful breakup with Gilbert Imlay, an American adventurer with whom she had a daughter, Fanny. He abandoned her, and Mary felt humiliated and heartbroken, especially as a single mother in a society that condemned women in her situation. Both of Wollstonecraft's daughters appeared to inherit her emotional intensity and sense of melancholy. Mary Wollstonecraft died shortly after giving birth to Mary Shelley due to puerperal fever, an infection caused by poor hygiene during childbirth. At that time, doctors didn't yet understand how to prevent infection, since germ theory and antiseptic procedures came later. So this kind of death was tragically common. He never caressed me. If ever he stroked my head or drew me on his knee, I felt a mingled alarm and delight difficult to describe. Yet, strange to say, my father loved me almost to idolatry, and I knew this and repaid his affection with enthusiastic fondness, notwithstanding his resort and my awe. He was something greater and wiser and better in my eyes than any other being. I was the sole creature he loved, the object of all his thoughts by day and his dreams by night. After his wife's death, Godwin threw himself into work. He went through Mary's papers and started writing a book to honor her. In 1798, he published Memoirs of the Author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and he wrote about her honestly, her love affairs, her feelings for other men, even her suicide attempts. His honesty backfired, and instead of making people admire her, it shocked them. Society saw her not as a brave, intelligent woman, but as unstable and immoral. Godwin seemed to develop an almost symbolic connection to the name Mary. He first proposed to Maria Revelli, a close family friend, but she refused. Later, he married Mary Jane Claremont, who became the stepmother of Mary Shelley. Godwin had hidden his courtship from his friends. Perhaps he sensed that they would disapprove. Tactless, gossip-loving, and habitually untruthful, Mary Jane struck most of them as a poor substitute for Mary Wollstonecraft. Even though some of them noted that she was a good wife, as well as Anne Godwin. Mrs. Claremont became certainly towards him a meritorious wife, though towards others I doubt both her sincerity and her integrity. Fanny was docile, but Mary kept as cool a distance as it possible for a small girl to maintain. Unaware of the risks, Godwin embraced Mary Jane's idea of bookselling as an easy source of income. Once he had despised booksellers as servile figures, but encouraged by praise and his wife's optimism, he set out to become one. Ironically, the venture that promised stability soon led to financial ruin. Poor management, misplaced trust, and overproduction plunged him into debt. A failure his daughter would later call his worst decision, though he always insisted it was one of his best. In 1805, when Mary was about 8, the Godwins moved from Somerstown to 41 Skinner Street in Holborn, also because of her stepmother. There, William and his wife Mary Jane opened a bookshop and publishing house, M.J. Godwin & Co., which doubled as their home and workplace. The house was filled with books, manuscripts, and perpetual anxiety about money. I detest Mrs. Godwin. She plagues my father out of his life. Mary often blamed herself for her mother's death, and this sense of guilt haunted her throughout her life, and also fueled the resentment towards her stepmother, whom she saw as an intruder taking the place she believed she had tragically caused to become vacant. Godwin was constantly paying off one debt by taking another. His friends and admirers often had to rescue the philosopher from financial trouble. Most of Mary's education came from the books in her father's bookshop. He often took his children on educational trips, and Mary grew up surrounded by her father's intellectual circle: writers, philosophers, and radicals. She never missed an opportunity to join their conversations. But she never received a formal education because, as I mentioned earlier, Godwin was against traditional schools and he saw them as prisons for the mind. So Mary learned at home, reading the classics from a very, very young age. In 1812, at the age of 14, Mary was sent to Dundee, Scotland, to live with the Baxter family, friends of her father. The move was intended to provide her with a healthier environment, remove her from the chaos and depths of Skinner Street, and give her the opportunity to broaden her education, especially to stimulate her interest in politics. Baxter's household had become closer to her idea of a real home than her father's house of trade. And at this time, Percy Bysshe Shelley was already reaching out to William Godwin in a series of letters. The first, on the 3rd of January, presented Shelley as an ardent Godwinian eager to learn, prompting Godwin's cautious request for clarification. By the second letter, on the 10th of January, Shelley had positioned himself not as a protégé, but as a potential patron, and Godwin's replies grew noticeably warmer. Percy Shelley came from a wealthy family. He inherited his good appearance from his mother, and according to people who knew him, he really was striking. Tall, slim, with curly hair and bright blue eyes. At the age of 10, he was sent to a boarding school where other boys mocked him for being different. Still, he was a good student. Later, he went to Eton, where he started writing and was soon recognized as a talented young poet. though his classmates call him Mad Shelley. After that, he went on to Oxford, but was expelled for publishing a pamphlet defending atheism. And then in 1814, Percy Shelley appeared at the Godwin's house. For Mary, Jane and Fanny, their father's new correspondent sounded like the hero of a romance. The frequency of Shelley's visit to Skinner Street in June must have been occasioned by his growing interest to Mary. Mary fell in love. She was just 15 and Percy was already 21 and married. 3 years earlier, he had run away with Harriet, the daughter of a tavern keeper. He wanted to rescue her from her tyrannical father, a very romantic gesture in his own eyes, even though he never truly loved her. I felt as if a dead and living body had been linked together in a loathsome and horrible communion. Percy's father was furious and cut him off financially. No mention was made of Harriet having been unfaithful. Also, this would later become Shelley's chief defense against charges of deserting his pregnant wife.
Let's hear it for the band of the year.
And he fell in love with Mary. They walked together a lot, talked and read, and when Mary asked about his marriage, Shelley hinted that Harriet had been unfaithful and that the baby might not be his. In fact, he had no reason for such suspicions. The first mention of this rumor came a year later from a gossip and not Shelley's. Yet, in his excitement, Shelley could say anything to gain sympathy. What mattered was that Mary believed him, having been raised to think honorable men never lied. Shelley later called the 27th of June his true birthday, though he was born on the 4th of August, hinting it was the day he and Mary first made love. Likely in the quiet corner of St. Pancras churchyard, near her mother's willow-shaded grave. Harriet, writing a bitter letter to her Irish friend, Catherine Nuggan, in November 1814, had no doubt. Mary was determined to seduce him. She is to blame. She heated his imagination by talking of her mother and going to her grave with him every day, till at last she told him she was dying of love for him. Mary's father didn't like the situation and forbade Mary to see Shelley, but this didn't stop them and they ran away, taking Claire with them. Hey, it's me editing, and I just realized that I forgot to introduce Claire, Mary Shelley's stepsister, daughter of Mary Jane Claremont. Here she is, and she's going to become a huge pain in the ass in the future and a very important figure in Mary's life. I think I'll appear a few more times throughout the video because my inner perfectionist says that you need more details. His reputation was ruined and he didn't forgive Mary for following his own ideas of free love. Also, Harriet even repeated the cruel rumor that Godwin had sold 2 children to Shelley for £1,500. First, they went to France by boat, accompanied by Claire, and Mary is gonna regret the decision so much of taking Claire with them. Shelley noted in his journal that they were too happy to sleep. Later, when they had managed to get some money, they continued on to Switzerland. Shelley calculated that with £60 they could reach Switzerland on foot. On the 8th of August, he and Claire bought a donkey to carry their belongings, but they forgot Mary's manuscripts and letters, which were never recovered. Soon out of Paris, the donkey collapsed and they swapped it for a mule at a steep price. Trekking southeast towards Troyes, under a scorching sun, they faced burnt-out villages, meager food, and sleepless nights. Also, Shelley sprained his ankle, riding the mule while the girls walked behind in their black silk dresses. After a week, they finally exchanged the mule for a carriage. In Switzerland, they spent all the money, Mary got pregnant, and they decided to return back to England, but Mary's father drove her away. They moved to a cheap apartment where they continued reading poetry and running from creditors. Shelley hung out with Claire, who became his mistress, and Mary had to endure this in the name of free love, because Shelley had the idea of creating a commune where sexual freedom would be practiced. The participants were Mary, Shelley, Claire, and Shelley's friend Hawke. But Mary showed no romantic and much less sexual interest in Hawke, while Claire demonstrated her liberated spirit by dividing her favors between the two young men. Mary was going through pains to spell out the fact that Shelley's would always have the first place in her heart. And at the beginning of January 1815, Shelley's grandfather died, and there was hope not to die of hunger. But as we remember, Shelley and his father also had a difficult relationship, and all this financial burden lasted almost a year. On February 22nd, Mary gave birth to a premature baby girl, but she didn't live long, causing Mary to become severely depressed. Even though infant mortality was tragically high in the 19th century, Mary felt the loss deeply. Dreamt that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we wrapped it before the fire and it lived. Awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day, not in good spirits. So now she bore the sense that not she only killed her mother, but she allowed her own baby to die. She was tormented by nightmares, depression, and feeling of guilt. Sharing the roof with Claire didn't do any better to her mental state, and even though Percy didn't like it, in 1815 Claire returned to the Godwin family, but for a short time. Mary became pregnant again and gave birth to a son, William Shelley, named after his grandfather. They affectionately called him Wilms. Well, Claire also wanted to have a poet of her own, and her gaze fell on the pop star of the time, Lord Byron, who created a cult around his biography, and Claire somehow managed to get into his romance. And although Byron was not in love with her even for a second, he then didn't practically refuse any woman. Claire wanted to secure Byron for herself through pregnancy, and well, she did manage to get pregnant. Not wanting to lose contact with him, she dragged Shelley and Mary to his villa. It's important to mention that Byron and Shelley were already intrigued by each other. Shelley admired Byron as the living image of the rebellious poet he himself inspired to be, while Byron was curious about the young idealist whose radical verses challenged religion and society alike. Byron also fled England due to scandals, growing debt, and rented Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva in Geneva. Percy, Mary, little William, and Claire lived in a modest house just across the road from the lake, when Byron shared the roof with his doctor, John Polidori. Fun fact that the doctor's diary suggests that he fell a little in love with Mary, and Byron, aware of the doctor's infatuations, jokingly suggested that Polidori leap from the balcony to offer Mary his arm as she climbed the hill to Diodati. The doctor gallantly obeyed and sprained his ankle. He was bedridden for more than a week, and Mary ended the matter firmly. Polidori recorded in his journal that Mrs. Shelley told him she regarded himself as a little brother. They spent time writing, reading poetry to each other, and going boating as long as the weather permitted. 1816 is the year of volcanic eruptions in Indonesia, which most likely caused a strong change in climate, and this year was considered the year without summer. Cold and raining almost continuously. Due to the bad weather, they spent the whole summer in Villa, amusing themselves by reading scary stories, or to be more precise, French translations of German fairy tales, instead of traveling, as it was planned at first. Byron proposed a competition to read the scariest story, and then Mary took this matter seriously. Byron began a story about vampires, which he had heard a lot about during his travels through the Balkans. Yes, Byron started that vampire story inspired by all those dark tales he'd heard while traveling through the Balkans. But it was John Polidori who actually took Byron's unfinished fragment and turned it into a complete story, The Vampire, published in 1819. When it first came out, the publishers released it under Byron's name, partly by mistake, but mostly because Byron was famous and they knew his name would sell. For a while, everyone thought it was Byron's new scandalous work, and Polidori was left completely in the shadow. And I made the same mistake. Mary had a dream that was inspired by Byron and Percy's discussions about Galvanism, the science of how electric current can revive dead tissue. Scientists like Luigi Galvani and Giovanni Adoni showed that frog muscles could twitch under the influence of electricity. They associated electricity as a kind of force that gives life to all living things. For people at the beginning of the 19th century, it seemed almost like magic. Life and death could seem to be controlled by current. In general, the phenomenon of electricity was shrouded in a certain mysticism and the potential for omnipotence. So, conversations about it can be compared with current discussions about AI. Mary wrote at night, in a small diary while Percy slept next to her. Often drafts began with images of lightning animating the body. The prototypes of Victor and the monster he created appeared to Mary in her dreams. Mary's fascination with Galvanism was not born out of idle curiosity, but from a deeply personal confrontation with loss in creation. Death had accompanied Mary since her first breath. Later, when she lost her own child, the wound reopened. The idea that a spark might awaken lifeless matter became for Mary not only a scientific curiosity, but a poetic act, a rebellion against death itself, and a way to reclaim the power of creation that had once taken her mother from her. Out of the tension between love and loss, she dreamt the vision of a man who would play God, and Frankenstein began to breathe. Mary originally intended Frankenstein to be a short story, but she did not finish writing it that summer because Shelley encouraged her to expand the idea into a full-length novel. By the way, Mary didn't know about Claire's pregnancy for quite a long time, while Shelley was already actively discussing with Byron that due to Byron's reluctance to financially support Claire with the child, Shelley would take this responsibility. In general, the child of Claire and Byron is a separate drama and is also the cause of a lot of dramas. Byron suggested that his half-sister Augusta could raise the baby, and Claire hated the idea. So they struck a shaky deal that Byron wouldn't hand the child to strangers for 7 years, and Claire could pretend to be its aunt until he decided otherwise. On the 29th of August, Mary Shelley and a very pregnant Claire packed up for England, taking Byron's new poems with them. Mary didn't show much sympathy, and any she might have felt would have vanished if she'd seen Claire's farewell letter. "I shall love you to the end of my life, and nobody else." Girl. They returned to England and settled in Bath. Unfortunately for Mary, Claire was with them, and Shelley promised to take responsibility for her well-being during her pregnancy. As I mentioned earlier, Mary had been rejected by her family. However, she continued corresponding with her other half-sister, Fanny, who remained living under the Godwin's roof. On October the 9th, Mary received a rather worrying letter from Fanny, which prompted Shelley to set out in search of her in Bristol, but he returned with nothing. It turned out that Godwin had also gone looking for Fanny after receiving a message in which she had written before leaving, "Depart immediately to the spot from which I hope never to remove." On the 9th of October, Fanny Godwin took a room at the Mackworth Arms in Swansea and ended her life by swallowing laudanum. In her final note, she wrote that she wished to end the existence of a being whose birth was unfortunate and whose life had only been a series of pain. Her stays bore Mary Wollstonecraft's initials, and she carried a gold Swiss watch given to her by Mary and Shelley in Geneva. The reason for her suicide remained uncertain. Godwin later suggested that Fanny had loved Shelley and had been unhappy since the elopement. Shelley's poem written soon after her death seems to echo this connection. Perhaps Fanny had hoped to join Mary, Shelley, and Clare in Bath, but was gently refused, a rejection that deepened her despair. Most likely she felt herself a burden to her impoverished family, inheriting her mother's melancholy but not her resilience. Fanny chose an obscure and lonely death. This was a strong blow for Mary and Shelley. In some ways, a common feeling of guilt towards Fanny's suicide brought them closer. Mary's journal for the weeks following Fanny's death shows a quiet and intensely studious life, brightened only by money worries and by her increasing impatience with Clare. They barely had time to recover when, a month after Fanny's death, Percy's former wife Harriet was found drowned in a lake. Shelley wanted to take custody of the children, but the authorities somehow deemed him unreliable. Although Harriet's suicide now legally allowed Percy and Mary to formalize their relationship, it did nothing to ease Mary's fragile mental state. Nevertheless, after the announcement of their wedding, Mary and Percy were invited to dine with the Godwins. On December 30th, 1816, they got married. The marriage was more an attempt to legitimize their union and restore their reputation than a romantic gesture. This constant wave of grief and loss drove Mary to begin writing the first chapters of Frankenstein, while Shelley spent much of his time away from home playing cat and mouse with his creditors. In 1818, Frankenstein was published anonymously, as was the custom at the time. This was unfortunate for Mary, with her husband writing the preface references to his friend, seemed a thin disguise for the fact that he had written the novel himself. Everyone assumed that Percy had written Frankenstein, since Mary was only 18 when she wrote it. People questioned her youth, her lack of formal education, and her presumed lack of experience. But by the time Frankenstein was published, she had already endured the death of her mother and her first child, the suicide of her half-sister, and the strain in her relationship with Shelley. She knew grief intimately, and that knowledge, sharpened by intellect, gave her imagination its haunting depth. Percy did make some edits, but only in the role of an editor. Critics who believed Shelley was the author treated the book with more understanding and interest than those who suspected it was written by a woman. In other reviews, where the author was described as the daughter of William Godwin, the novel's flaws were often explained away simply because it was written by a woman. The fact that only 500 copies of Frankenstein had been published didn't mean that it went unnoticed on its appearance. In her home circle, Mary was showered with praise, and her father even wrote to her, "The most wonderful work to have been written at 20 years of age that I have ever heard of." She was actually 19. On the 2nd of September 1817, Mary gave birth to a girl named Clara, and in March 1818, Mary and Percy, with their children, decided to go to Italy. And Claire, of course, as well. As we remember, Claire was pregnant with Byron's child, and her reason for coming was to secure her daughter's future. Firstly, Byron seemed like he didn't want to take a child, but his opinion soon changed, since he found out that there was no chance for him to gain in custody on Ada, his own legitimate child. When Shelley found out about Byron's disreputable time in Venice, he offered Claire to keep looking after the child as a part of their own family. No sense to mention that this idea horrified Mary, even though it appealed to Claire. Luckily for Mary, they changed their minds and went to Venice to hand Claire's child Allegra over to Byron. 8 days later, when the Gisbornes arrived to lighten Mary's solitude, they found her pale and nervous. Little Clara was ill. Despite Clara's illness, Shelley demanded Mary travel immediately with the sick baby across Italy to join him and Claire, and instead to persuade Byron to come and assist Claire with Allegra, Claire's daughter. Exhausted and anxious, she had to pack up the whole house and organize the journey with a young and experienced nursemaid. Mary was completely frustrated and must have been rigid with resentment of Claire, who refused to leave Allegra in their friend's care to hand her over to Byron, as well as with Shelley's cavalier attitude towards her.
Let's hear it for the band of the year.
When she arrived, Clara's health deteriorated and doctors in Este were simply inadequate, so Mary and Percy left Este to take Clara to Dr. Aglietti in Venice, following Byron's advice. On the slow journey along the Brenta Canal towards Venice, they were delayed because their passports had been forgotten and Austrian border guards initially refused passage. Only Clara's convulsions or Shelley's fury persuaded them to let them through. Mary waited in an inn, holding Clara, while Shelley fetched Dr. Aglietti. When he returned, Clara was dead, leaving Mary alone and grief-stricken. This is a journal book of misfortunes, Mary wrote in her diary that evening. On the 7th of June, Mary's son William died from malaria. What sin, she wondered, could have merited such relentless punishment? Her next child was due to born in November 1918, and she dreaded the beginning of another cycle of hope, love and loss. Her relationship with Shelley also became strained because he simply refused to participate in her grief, as it was only her grief. He could not be near his wife, blaming both herself and him for the death of their children. This deep sorrow of Mary became a major inspiration for writing Matilda, which explores the theme of the helplessness of a parent facing tragedy. Mary hated sharing her roof and husband with Claire and being constantly compared with her cheerful nature. In August, Claire went to Florence to stay with Dr. Buiti, learn languages, and prepare for an independent life. Mary, after 5 years with her stepsister, could finally hope to be free of her. Well, even though the weather is not helping, I had a vision of recording at least a part of the video in the forest, so here we are. Mary seemed wholly absorbed in caring for her newborn son Percy. She was also glad that Claire was restricted to paying occasional visits, but Shelley, in turn, grew noticeably distant. In October 1820, he heard about a trip to the Middle East and immediately thought of Claire, expecting she would want to go with him. We don't know her answer, but it seems like Shelley may have thought about leaving his wife and child to go travel the world with her.
Let's hear it for the band of the year.
Throughout their relationship, Mary lived with a constant fear that Shelley might abandon her for someone else, just as he had once left Harriet for her. And judging by Shelley's fickle nature, her fear was more than reasonable. Still, life went on, the couple continued their restless search for peace and inspiration, and Bysshe became their home from 1820. In 1822, Mary, Claire and Shelley moved in with their friends Jane and Edward Williams. Jane, a year younger than Mary, came from a military family. She married a strict naval captain at 16, but separated from him the next year. She then fell in love with Edward Williams and, like Mary, boldly left England in 1819 to be with him. They lived in Geneva and had a son, Edward Medwin, and were expecting a second child. Her courage and independence were enough to win Mary's sympathy and likely Shelley's as well. Soon, Jane Williams is going to become one of the most important figures in Mary's life. So, from June till late summer, the two families lived in carefree joy, laughing, talking and wandering together. Being in such easy, undermining company, Mary felt her girlhood returning. But the brightness of that summer was shadowed by Shelley's fragile condition. His health was never strong. He often suffered from stomach aches, fainting and long periods of exhaustion. But it wasn't just his body that troubled him. Shelley's mind was restless. He was often anxious, sleepless, and lost in dark thoughts. Shelley sometimes saw things that weren't really there. He once said that he met his own double, walking on the terrace, pale, silent, and pointing towards the sea. At other times, he spoke of hearing voices calling his name or whispering warnings. These visions terrified Mary, who feared they were omens. Italian climate didn't help, and as I said before, he was very unsatisfied with his relationship with Mary, since his heart was longing for those fresh feelings of first love. This was the summer when he addressed her one of his cruelest poems.
We are not happy, sweet. Our state is strange and full of doubt and fear, more need of word that ills abate. Resolve or censure come not near our sacred friendship. Let there be no solace left for thee and me. Gentle and good and mild thou art, nor can I live if thou appear aught by thyself, or turn thine heart away from me, or stoop to wear the mask of scorn, although it be to hide the love thou feelst for me.
So he was mostly hanging out with cheerful Claire, who, according to his words, was still a source of disquietude to him and whose absence would make him suffer from a solitude of the heart. Meanwhile, Jane Williams also became his new muse. Shelley wrote passionate poems for her and often showed her his works before anyone else. Edward Williams, her husband, seemed rather flattered to see Jane so admired, which made it even harder to imagine how Mary was supposed to play the role of a loving wife. Mary, who had always been attentive and devoted, now found herself overshadowed by Jane's charm and Shelley's fascination with her. In his letters to friends, Shelley chose to present himself as the victim of Mary's coldness, portraying her as distant and unfeeling. This version of events ignored Mary's constant care for him and their child, casting her instead as the one at fault for any tension in their marriage. Byron came to Pisa in 1821 and Mary was genuinely glad to see him. However, his arrival reopened old wounds. Claire announced that she could no longer be apart from her daughter Allegra and wanted Shelley to help her abduct Allegra from the convent in Bagnacavallo, where Byron had placed her. Mary was trying hard to persuade Claire not to do it, fearing for Shelley's safety. Such a bold move could have led Byron to challenge him to a duel. Only later did Mary and Percy learn that Allegra had already died from typhus, a truth they agreed to keep from Claire. On 16th of June, Mary almost died from severe blood loss due to a miscarriage. Percy, realizing there was no time to fetch help, placed her in a bath full of ice-cold water to stop the hemorrhage. It saved her, but the experience left her weak and deeply shaken. Together with Edward Williams, Percy bought a two-masted schooner, which he named Don Juan after Byron's poem. Shelley was a capable sailor and thoroughly enjoyed his new toy. On July 1st, 1822, Shelley and Williams set sail for Livorno, where Shelley planned to meet Byron to discuss a new journal project, The Liberal. The weather was terrible and there were numerous warnings that sailing at that time was, to put it mildly, unwise. But Shelley didn't give a fatal decision was made, and during that voyage, Shelley and Edward perished at sea. 10 days after the storm, 3 bodies were washed ashore. Mary's torment had begun the moment she heard that Shelley's body had been found. She blamed herself for everything, every quarrel, every distance, every word left unsaid. The grief was so overwhelming and the guilt never truly left her. As Shelley's body burned on the shore, Mary's love was already being judged. No relic was brought back for her at first. At that time, it was normal for people to keep a small part of someone who had died as a keepsake, like a lock of hair or even a piece of bone. Shelley's skull, who had been meant for Byron, crumbled, and Edward Trelawney burned his hands trying to save a piece of Shelley's heart. Probably it didn't burn during the cremation because it had hardened from an earlier case of tuberculosis, which made it survive the fire. Honestly, Edward Trelawney's devotion to Shelley got a little too intense. They'd known each other for half a year? Yet he began to feel a kind of veneration that would in time rival Mary's own devoted love. To be fair, it was partly Mary's own fault. She allowed Trelawney, after supervising the cremation, to arrange and even help to dig Shelley's final burial place in Rome. And Trelawney took that as something deeply symbolic. He even wrote to Mary later, proudly describing the laurels and cypresses he'd planted around the grave, and casually adding that he dug another spot right next to Shelley's, so that when I die, there is only to lift up my coverlet and roll me into it. Then he told her that she could have the place on the other side, if you like. Mary saw it as her duty to defend and preserve Shelley's reputation, a way to atone for the guilt she felt. She blamed herself, not him, for their unhappiness and believed that honoring his genius would be her act of reparation. Byron was helping Mary with money, and in general they had a very warm relationship after Shelley's death. Mary faithfully kept a lock of his hair. The only others she kept were of her children, her mother, and Shelley. Byron had asked Sir Timothy, Shelley's father, about helping Mary financially, but in February 1823 the answer was harsh. He blamed Mary for breaking up his son's life and refused any allowance. His lawyer, Wheaton, also refused to help. The only offer was that Sir Timothy would support Mary's son Percy, but only if he was taken from her care and placed with someone else chosen by the Shelleys. Faced with these conditions, Mary realized that returning to England was the only way she could protect her son's rights, take charge of his upbringing, and support herself financially through work, including her writing. I'm just in the process of moving out from this apartment, that's why I'm constantly in search for a decent corner. Shared grief became a solid ground for deep connection between Jane and Mary. In a letter to Edward Trelawney, Mary wrote, "I was so ready to give myself away, and being afraid of men, I was apt to get too simussy for women." Well, I decided that it's also important to mention that this kind of shift wasn't about romance. Well, maybe at some level. It was more about trust and safety. After the loss she had experienced, Mary found it easier to open her heart and place her trust in women who offered companionship, understanding, and space to love without fear. Later, when introduced at social gatherings, she would even insist on being presented as Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, daughter of the celebrated authoress of The Rights of Woman. It was her quiet statement of identity, her way of aligning herself not with her husband's fame, but with her mother's legacy. There is no certain proof that Mary had a romantic or sexual relationship with Jane, but they did exchange passionate and loving letters. After returning to England, the two lived together in Kentish Town, and Jane helped Mary to re-enter society. She was also on hand to comfort and help her when little Percy was ill, and together they would boldly go to the theatre alone during those times. Mary also hoped that once she dealt with the money issues that Timothy Shelley caused her, she could return to Italy and live with Jane. But her dreams were crushed at Jane's marriage to Percy's friend, Thomas Jefferson Hawke, the one who was involved in a free love commune back when Mary, Percy, and Claire lived together in England. Jane grew colder, planning her future with Hawke. Unlike Mary, who would write in her letters, "She is in truth my all, and I live to all good and pleasure only through her." Mary clung to heart, and it frightened Jane, so she drew back. By the spring of 1826, Jane was already pregnant and ready to set up home with her lover. She also betrayed Mary by spreading rumors and damaging her reputation by reporting her to have been a cold wife who had driven Shelley almost to seek his own death. Nevertheless, the fact that Jane abandoned her for Hawke seemed even more hurtful for Mary. Could any but yourself have destroyed such engrossing and passionate love? I have committed many faults. The remorse of love haunts me often and brings bitter tears to my eyes. But for 4 years, I committed not one fault towards you. In larger, in minute things, your pleasure and satisfaction were my objects, and I gave up everything that is all the very little I could give up to them. I make no boast. Heaven knows had you loved me, you were worth all. The friendship survived, but only because Mary insisted that it must, and of course their relationship will never be the same again. In the meantime, Mary also began writing The Last Man, feeling herself the last survivor of the romantic circle from Villa Diodati. Polidori had taken his own life, Shelley had drowned, and Byron too was gone. He had died in 1824 in Greece, not on a battlefield at Missolonghi, but on a bed of fever and excessive bloodletting. One by one, her extraordinary companions had vanished, and Mary was left alone to confront the losses of her world. The Last Man is one of the first apocalyptic books in which she described the end of humanity from an unknown plague. It was basically the forerunner of all those films. Mary also worked on Byron's biography after his death, and it became a huge source of Claire's discontent. Byron was the man who had spurned her love, put her child in a convent, and left her there to die. But Mary, far from exposing Byron as a monster, seemed intent on glorifying his name. By the 1830s, Percy Bysshe Shelley had become a celebrated poet, thanks in large part to Mary, who worked tirelessly to honor his name. Timothy Shelley forbade publishing anything under the Shelley name, threatening to disinherit Mary's only surviving child, Percy. He was deeply worried that his son's scandals would bring shame to the family. Because he had guardianship over Mary's son, he held considerable power, and Mary, needing money throughout her life, had to act almost secretly. In 1824, Shelley's friend Trelawney and Thomas Medwin published the poet's first collections, but Mary couldn't participate openly. When she finally published posthumous poems, Timothy insisted the book be withdrawn from sale and threatened legal actions, leading most copies being destroyed. But in 1839, Mary managed to publish the poetical works of Percy Bysshe Shelley. Publishers asked her to soften the radical spirit of Shelley's poems, but Mary refused. Shelley's relatives also didn't want the poet's scandalous biography to become public. Nevertheless, Mary succeeded in telling her husband's story by including extensive biographical notes alongside his poems. Though she was surrounded by admiration and was in fact proposed to 4 times, including once by Edward Trelawney, she refused them all. "I have been married to one genius," she said, "and I can marry only another." Her last try to build a connection with someone turned out as a story of betrayal and blackmail. In 1843, Mary met Giuseppe Gatecci. He was an Italian poet and political exile who moved in the same intellectual circle as she did. Gatecci admired her, and as their friendship grew closer, they started exchanging personal letters. But over time, Mary began to distance herself from him, realizing that his interest in her was not as sincere as she had thought. It was indeed profitable for him to keep her nearby due to her connections, feeling of cultural and emotional superiority that he felt by keeping contact with a widow of a genius, and the potential for financial support. Gatecci reacted badly, and he accused her of using him and eventually began to threaten her, saying that he would publish her letters if she didn't give him money. For Mary, who has spent years rebuilding her reputation after the scandals of her youth, this was frightening. With the support of the British ambassador in Paris, her son managed to recover the letters and Gatecci returned them. Obviously, after this incident, Mary cut off all contacts with him, destroyed the remaining letters, and refused to mention him ever again. Apart from a life marked by loss and betrayal, Mary also suffered from recurrent headaches, seizures, and fatigue. Symptoms later believed to have been caused by a long-standing brain tumor. On the 23rd of January 1851, she suffered a series of fits and fell into a coma from which she never awoke. Her physician, Dr. Richard Bright, concluded that the paralysis was the result of brain damage and that her condition was hopeless. The coma lasted 8 days. Surrounded by her son Percy, his wife Jane, and her devoted mate Mary Ann Henry, she passed away quietly on the 1st of February without a sound. Mary Shelley's life is a reminder that pain and the ability to feel deeply can give birth to something truly beautiful. Out of loss, loneliness, and love, she created a story that still speaks to us centuries later. Thank you so much for watching till the end. I really hope you enjoyed my first attempt at making a video and that my little amateur mistakes didn't distract you too much. I'm planning to make a separate video about Frankenstein, and I think it won't be as long as this one, though in that video I'll try to share even more about what inspired Mary to write it and why I think it's still worth reading today. Thanks again for being here, and I hope to see you soon.